one night, I got up to go to the bathroom. It must have been after midnight. And I saw this light. So I came on out to the foyer, and there was a state trooper's car parked right behind Dr. Halen's office. So I looked across the street, and there was another one parked between the church and the parsonage. So I said to my friend May, that she lived in the house next door, I said, May, you know the cops is parked in your driveway. And she said,
Ladybug.
She always called me Ladybug.
They've been doing that ever since Dr. King left.
Oh.
Yes, one morning, here come those troopers, and they said they come to see about you.
What you mean come and see about me?
They said they'll be parked in front of your house if it takes the next 6 months.
But why?
Well, 'cause of the movement.
And that's when I really got afraid.
I remember before we got Dr. King to come to St. Augustine, I took my 4 children and I went to Boynton Beach to my parents' house because I was afraid. You see, one day when I came home from work, this lady from across the street who worked for this white family came over and said,
Mrs. Wright, I gotta tell you something. I was working this party last night, and I heard them say, we gonna get rid of that nigger preacher Thomas Wright. You need to warn your husband.
At that time, Thomas was the pastor of St. Mary's Baptist Church. He was organizing and leading the NAACP. He had gotten this group of young men to do a sit-in at the dime store in downtown St. Augustine. Of course, they wouldn't serve them, but those boys sat and sat all day. They would curse them and do all kinds of things. And finally, one day, they jumped on one young man and they beat him unmercifully. He needed a doctor. But Thomas was afraid because there were no black medical doctors in St. Augustine, only a dentist. So we had to drive to Palatka to take him to a doctor who patched up his wounds. We drove back to St. Augustine and took care of him until he recuperated, got back on his feet.
I wanted to be a physical therapist or do something in the medical field. But when I got to Virginia Union College, I met Frank Pinkston. He was a senior and a very good football player. I would go to the games with my friends and I would see him, around campus. I don't know, one thing led to another and we fell in love. We were married in December 1958. When Frank received his bachelor's, he enrolled in theological seminary at Union. And instead of a physical therapist, I became Mrs. Frank Pinkston. And of course, not long after that, babies came. And that was the end of my protesting. The sit-ins were in 1960, I think. 34 students, I think they called them the Richmond 34, were arrested at Thalaman's lunch counter. I was watching the news on television that night, and I saw Frank being arrested and put into a police car. But I was so proud of him and the other students. I was just sorry that I wasn't there to join them.
The threats happened after that sit-in beating. That is when I took my children and I left. I told Thomas he needed to come too, but he said, I am not going. Well, I said, I don't mind dying for the cause. And maybe you don't mind dying for the cause. But I do not want my children to die for the cause because they're too young to understand what this is all about. Eventually, it got so dangerous, we had to flee St. Augustine, and we moved to Gainesville. Thomas was preaching at Mount Carmel Baptist Church. We lived in the parsonage. They would call and curse us. Sometimes they would just call and breathe heavy. not say a word, just breathe heavy. One day they called and said they're going to put a bomb under our house and the church. We had to evacuate. They brought in this team that knew about bombs, and they went over everything with a fine-tooth comb, and they didn't find any evidence of any bombs. But that made us restless for 3 or 4 months. I had trouble sleeping. My children didn't feel safe.
Back in the day, Mr. Dr. Martin Luther King used to stay with me. And he was not the type that would come in and demand this or that. Whatever you fixed for him, he was grateful. I would come home at night, I would do steak. I would do T-bone steaks. I would do mashed potatoes or tossed salad rolls. For me, this kind of thing would be too heavy that time of night. One morning I was getting ready to leave and I said, "Doc, what would you like for me to leave for you?" And he said, "Don't you worry about me eating. All I want you to do is leave me some tea. You make the best iced tea and I love it."
Frank was destined to be someone great. He had the ability to just pull people in. That's why I wasn't surprised at how big he got when we moved to Ocala. He emerged as the area's civil rights movement's leader in 1963. The thing that surprised me was that it was the women who were the most outspoken and supported the movement. Some of the men were reluctant to get involved because they had jobs, and they knew that the white man had the ability to, quote unquote, terminate at will, and they had families to support. Frank was very serious about our movement being a nonviolent movement. Our meetings were when the community came together to listen and learn about what had taken place during the week, if anyone had been arrested or if there were any problems. And then we would have a sermon from Frank that would just tear the roof off a Covenant Missionary Baptist church. When we left there, we felt empowered. It was like, we can do this. It's not going to be easy, but we can do this.
It really was an opportunity for me to have been in Mr. King's presence as much as I was at that time, because my son and my husband was heavy into the movement. One night after one of the demonstrations, Doc said to my son, he said, "Roland, you ain't hit nobody, did you?" And Roland said, "Well, I kind of rubbed up against one or two of them." And Doc said, "Well, I forgive you, 'cause that's that vicious in your mama coming out." King was an amazing person. He really was. He always meditated before he talked to anybody. He meditated. They would come up to that door and they'd say, "Doc, Mr. So-and-so here to see you." He'd say, "Okay." And he'd sit there. And when his head would come up, that person would walk through that door. It was amazing. And they used to all come out to my house. Yeah, he met everybody at my house. That was his headquarters at the time, and you could find him there day and night. He'd have about 10 reporters on the phone. Yeah, and that was in my kitchen. I don't know what he'd be saying to them. His voice was just that soft. We would sit on the porch. We would sit on the steps, and the Klan would ride by every day. Every day we'd sit there, and the Klan rode by, and we just watched and waved. They ain't never done anything. Just wanted us to know they knew he was there. And yet, I wasn't ever afraid. I only got afraid after he left.
I told him many times, for the safety of the children, that he needed to stop this and turn it over to someone younger. I wanted my children to have a chance at life. That didn't matter. He continued in the movement. It was difficult at times. He was gone most of the time, and every time that phone would ring, I would jump, wondering if someone's calling to say that he had been hurt. I'm just so thankful we all made it.